Hey, everybody. Welcome to What's the Function. I'm your host, John Firth, and today I am joined by Matthew Henry, our CIO in transition. And today we're going to be talking about nonprofits, IT, CrowdStrike. I don't know what else we're going to talk about, but we're going to load it up and have a great episode today. So thank you for joining me.
Yes, thank you, John. Very good to be here.
So one thing that we talked about before, and we're back again, and hopefully the recording works this time, is nonprofit IT is this very unique sector. And in that sector, there are nonprofits that can afford a lot, and there are nonprofits that cannot afford much at all. And, there are great programs out there with Microsoft, Google, and others that kind of can help nonprofits bootstrap this or, maybe pay for licensing. But generally, they're not in the game of deploying it for the nonprofits or managing it for a nonprofit. And I found that can be more of a hurdle than paying for the licensing, right? Having multiple people on an IT staff and trying to manage this entire thing. And I'm going to relate this back in. We were just talking about CrowdStrike a second ago before we hit record. And it's very interesting, your perspective that you brought up, which is even if these nonprofits got affected, would they have the actual physical manpower to go in and remediate this situation? For those who don't know, the CrowdStrike issue required a manual intervention. The machines kept boot looping. You had to actually go in, delete a file, and then mystically it would work. Now, as we know, that can take longer than a couple clicks, right?
Right.
So it was really interesting, and I want to elaborate that a bit. Even if you have the licensing, even if you have the technology, there are things that can come into place that you can't control. That can really wreck things for people. And I think that consolidating down onto a more manageable platform where there's less little pieces that can go wrong can be of a benefit. But I'd like to really get you to weigh in on that a bit.
Yeah, I think, and thank you, John. It's great to be here. I think I'm going to generalize, and I don't mean to generalize because we're talking about nonprofits, and nonprofits are small, big. I've worked for 200 person nonprofits. I've worked for 400, 500 person nonprofits, higher education, advocacy, childcare, early learning, various places. And so the thing that always is, thinking especially about CrowdStrike is nonprofits generally are doing a ton of work with an incredible mission and vision, impacting people. And again, my generalization, I don't want to say that not nonprofits are not doing some of the same things, but thinking about why they've got started, why they're doing. And you have, one person nonprofits, you have, 5-person nonprofits, and, the stats show that there's a lot of more the smaller nonprofits than there are the bigger nonprofits, but you still need to take advantage of the technology. And so when we've made the transition, so, you can see my gray hair and so forth. So I've been in computers for a long time. And, back when there was this word called mainframe, and then that turned into mini computer. The only difference between a mainframe and a mini computer is how much electricity I think it ran on. But, in that progression, then we ended up with these little tiny things that sit, on your desk. And, now these things that, sit in our purses and things like that, we call a smartphone. Well, those devices actually, I think, give us a sense that we all know technology. Now, if you're, again, I'm generalizing, but if you're 20 to 30 or younger than 20, you probably do know technology really well because you've only lived in that digital generation. But when you look at that of trying to run a business with that,
very different.
It's very different. So speaking of CrowdStrike, you just assume that, your computer that, you bought wherever is going to have your spreadsheets on it. Maybe you're doing a social media campaign. Maybe you're recording for TikTok or something great. You're doing a rally, downtown in DC or something the next day. And all of a sudden you wake up and you're excited and you get ready and you can't boot your computer.
Yep.
And, if you're a 10-person, nonprofit, you're going to call, I have a 20-year-old son. You're going to call my 20-year-old son and say, hey, why isn't my computer?
I get those calls all the time. All the time.
Why isn't my computer booting up? And, it's always like, well, just power it off and power it back on again. But in this case,
it was doing it
was
itself.
doing it.
Yeah.
And so you have to look at technology as a strategic part of the nonprofit, and that's so incredible. But it's also, and not faulting anybody, but that's a situation that with technology being part of our lives, we just don't think of that. And especially if we are excited and running nonprofits and doing those things, we haven't taken a look at the necessary funding, the necessary budget, the necessary strategy for a nonprofit.
And what I've noticed a lot is, and this is in smaller nonprofits, so once again, generalizing a little bit, but in smaller nonprofits and other organizations, they bootstrap a lot. And, they grab whatever's off the shelf closest to them, what they know. Google made a really big play into education a while ago. They've since receded a bit out of education. But because of that, we had probably 10 years of people that were really, really familiar with Google Docs, Google Drive, Google Things. And then they got to the workplace, and, well, the world runs on Microsoft, whether people want to admit it or not. Like, the average computer in a business or in a federal position is going to be a Windows machine. So, there was a transition period. And I think some people still just want that ease of use. Like you're saying, well, you're a millennial, you're Gen Z, or now Gen Alpha. You just know how technology works. No, they might know how consumer technology works. They might understand, like, oh yeah, I can send this email or whatever, but they may not understand business technology and business grade technology. So even things like CrowdStrike can bewilder a computer literate millennial or Gen Z, because it's not in the typical
exactly
flow of work.
Yeah. And I think, just was reading this week, working with a nonprofit, helping them get started in their technology, and they want to use Google Workspace, and like, okay, well, let's look at that. And so fortunately, and this is just recent, but and there's other vendors that have done a much better job. I don't want to diss any technology, but there's other vendors that have done a much better job of this all along. But in the last 6 months or so, Gmail has just really cut down on just the emailing part. So, I mean, a throttling email, I think it's to like 5,000 from one address a day. And so if you're doing campaigns to your donors, you hit that 5,000 limit and you're like, oh, what happened? I can't email anymore for the next 24 hours.
Yeah.
So getting all these, technical things, the DKIM and all this stuff set up in Google now is a requirement to be able to even turn on your business address for making sure that you can email, so that you can effectively use that technology. Well, again, if all you've ever done is set up a personal Gmail account, you've not been asked to do that. And so if you're, and I know, nonprofits are like, I'm just going to use my Gmail account, especially if you're a small 1 or 2 people, folks. Well, you can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Because your personal email account, if you're going to send out, hey, please donate to us, or, just, hey, we're up and running type of thing, or, in whatever mission you're doing, you're gonna not be able, that email's not going to get where it needs to go. And so your critical business process, which is email, is not going to do what you think it can do unless you look at it from a business perspective.
Something funny to note on that. So Microsoft and Google are in alignment on the DKIM thing, and that came out a couple weeks ago. But now, if you're not using DKIM or verification on your email, Outlook actually puts a red tag beside it that says unverified, and it tags the full-on email that it is unverified. So if you are a nonprofit or a smaller organization and you're like, oh yeah, we're just gonna, you might be showing up on your clients or on your donors as an unverified account. And not only does it look bad, but if I'm asking for donations, the one thing I definitely don't want to see is that my account is unverified.
That's right.
Right? Like that is a scary thing. That immediately flashes a red flag. Oh, this isn't the actual donor, email. This is a phishing or and we've trained everybody. Hey, if you see weird things, don't click.
Yep, exactly.
So you're probably actually reducing the actual reach of your campaigns and everything by not going through the right channels.
Yep. And funny side story. So you introduced me as a CIO in transition. So for all the other CIO and other people that are in transition, I have been and thought I could use my Gmail account for, managing my transition phase. I've learned over the last couple of weeks that my Gmail account goes to spam almost immediately. I've never used it to do any, donation campaigns or anything like that. It's just the systems out there treat a gmail.com account as very susceptible.
Mhm.
So I've had to go out and, buy my own domain. It's not that expensive. It's not that hard to do. And I found that I don't have any more issues with people saying, I never got your information.
Yeah.
Because if it's not a Gmail account anymore. So that's like, we're talking about nonprofits and the criticality of them understanding business. Email is, whether we like it or not, is the transaction of business. And if you can't guarantee that your email is getting to the person that you need it to go to in a timely manner and in a manner that's not sitting in their spam folder or is not, being deprioritized and so forth, then you're not going to be effective at your work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And then it's really like, we're going to harp on this for a second, but it is using business tools for a business case.
Yep.
And then really identifying. I did not realize, and I'll be completely honest, I was an engineer for many, many years, and I did not realize how powerful PowerPoint was until I became like a director. And then I was like, oh, I got to give a presentation. And then I was like, oh, well, I see all these things that people do from Microsoft or whoever, and they're these amazing PowerPoints. I was like, oh, they must have had a marketing team, and they must have had no, PowerPoint is just very powerful.
Yep.
And you can make some beautiful like videos and things just out of PowerPoint, flyers, things like that. And it still is weird and kind of strange to me that, we don't use those tools, and we don't train, I actually think to our fault, millennials were, oh yeah, you were taught this in school. And now Gen Z, oh yeah, you definitely were taught this in school.
Yep.
But the education system is like, well, no, they're learning this because they're just in this generation.
Right.
So we have this like cat and mouse game of like, well, how are you going to learn the tool versus like, you have to use this tool.
Yep.
So it is a very interesting conundrum, especially to be someone of my age, because it's like, oh, you should know this. The amount of times that I get like computer questions and I'm like, look, I built my career on enterprise migration to the cloud, not on desktop computers.
Right.
I don't know how, there's a lot of things in a desktop computer or an iPad or whatever that I'm not the best at, but if you give me Microsoft 365 email and you need an Exchange migration, I'm your guy. Yeah.
And maybe, it's a funny analogy. So I mentioned my 22-year-old, and both of our kids really haven't had it's a generational thing. They haven't, why do I need a driver's license, Dad? I can use the subway, or, you can take me, and so forth. So we've been working on, driving for our youngest. And, we don't have a new car, but we have a car that has, automated cruise control. And, I use it all the time because I'm a technologist and I like to
I'm the same way.
Make sure it works. My wife, and she's probably going to hear this and say, why did you talk about me? My wife is like, never touches it. And she's like, just never use it. So we've been getting out to the point where, going to get the full license and, through the driver's ed stuff and stuff like that. So they've enjoyed the freeways around DC, which if you ever live in DC, the freeways aren't something that normal people enjoy. But it's my child's favorite place to drive because they get to use the technology.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because we've had these discussions in our house. It's like, Mom, you've never used the automated cruise control. It's like having a self-driving car. And I'm telling my friends that I'm driving a self-driving car because it stops, it starts, it moves and stuff like that. And it's like, it takes a couple little buttons and so forth. But when you think about, if you're a nonprofit trying to get from point A to point B, and you bought a car, and you're just like, why use that car for running errands? And I get in, I put the key in and so forth. But there are so many pieces of even a car today with all these technology bells and whistles that will not only make your life easier, but will make your life safer.
Yes.
And make your business safer.
When I first started in my, we'll call it engineering journey, I did do, anybody who asked, I always did Exchange migrations to Microsoft 365. That's how I built my career and really got started. And I told people today, especially the younger engineers, as we're coaching and training, you guys have it way easier. You don't understand how many bells and whistles are available. Back when we started first working Microsoft 365, the example I always go to is I had to use a PowerShell to convert a user mailbox to a shared mailbox.
Yeah, been there, done that.
and these guys are like, you had to PowerShell that? And it's like, yeah, like, fast forward 10 years, it's a button that you click and it's on the main portal.
That's right.
But if you're not up to speed on that and you don't know the history, then you won't know how great you have it.
Yep.
But they don't need to know how great they
Yep.
have it. They just need to know, hey, I have this car. It has all these bells and whistles,
Yep.
and they're more likely to use it versus me, who's
Yep.
so used to PowerShelling things. I'll probably still PowerShell
Yep,
it.
exactly.
So yeah, it is that generational gap of like,
Yep.
I'm still going to do it the way I want, but we all do have to realize maybe we should try these features
Yep.
out. Maybe we
Yep,
should turn these
exactly.
knobs. Maybe we should get a little bit more security in place. It's not just email in the
Yep,
cloud. It's
exactly.
not just cloud storage.
Yep.
There are so many other things that can go into it, from data classification all the way to, mobile device management, cloud
Yep.
PCs, helping your frontline workers, which is a really big area that I think nonprofits can grow in. A lot of these are volunteer driven.
Yep.
And they don't know what to do with volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you give them an email account? Do they use their Gmail account? How do you schedule them? Yep. All of those moving pieces are actually solved with some pretty basic technology that's built in.
Yep. And, we were talking about cost earlier, but just to your point about all these, technologies that these built in, especially in a situation we have volunteers, because most nonprofits have a whole, nation or world sometimes of volunteers. And these days, a lot of them like to have an email address that says, nonprofit.org on that. But the pricing and the budget, you say, well, I don't have enough money. But you look at the vendors that are offering these incredible discounts and, so many for no cost and things like that for nonprofits, because they know and they want to give back, and they do give back. So it is really about, understanding all of the things that are available for your work.
And I think that has originally in the cloud, we talked about in like 2013, 2014, we talked about removing complexities. And we talked about, we're going to go to the cloud and set it and forget it and all of these things. Well, fast forward 10 years, we didn't realize what we were getting into. We didn't realize the security challenges that we were going to face in the cloud. We didn't realize that there were a lot of features that people use that they had built onto these platforms. And now we're in the cloud and these features being tacked on.
Yep.
Well, it's not just email and SharePoint, which it once was. Now it's email and SharePoint and security and DLP and, you name it. There's Teams, there's collaboration, there's real-time collaboration versus like asynchronous collaborate. All of these things that we never accounted for, and now we really have to. And I don't know that nonprofits are seeing that because I think a lot of that message 10 years ago was, hey guys, you just take this, move on to it once, set it, forget it, Showtime oven type thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think, just maybe pull back a little bit, but most nonprofits, well, I should say businesses in general, do, strategic plans, and nonprofits do strategic plans, and they put a lot of money and effort into that, making sure that strategic plan has the voice, I would say number one, has the voice of a technologist in building that strategic plan, because there should be direct ties to that strategic
100%.
plan for all of the technology things. And obviously, if you're doing measuring, doing KPIs around that, there should be, specific, KPIs around those strategic plan things, but also especially the technology things. And so as you work through that process, there are organizations obviously that can help you. There are people that will volunteer your time, that to help you with that and so forth. And obviously, if you have any staff and technology staff, but it's critical, because I think one of the things, and it's not a word that you hear a lot anymore, but in the beginning days of all of this sort of software as a service space and cloud-based stuff, you got all of these Googles and all these things spinning themselves up. So there was this IT, the shadow IT, and so you would have organizations that would have maybe the development team is using and I'll just give a scenario that I haven't seen because it's pretty wild, but let's say the development team is actually using maybe Google for their email, and the advocacy team on the Hill is using Apple for their email, and then the finance department is using Microsoft. So you've got essentially 3 email systems that you're trying. So if you're building your strategic plan for the next 2 years, 3 years, and you look at that, and then you budget for that, you have to realize that that's very expensive just in the cost of what you're having to pay for 3 email systems. But then you start talking about spam and whaling and phishing and all this kind of stuff, and then you start adding that up, and then the first time someone on any of those systems clicks on an email
Yep.
and sends out, the credit card information for the organization, and all of a sudden, you get, BitLocked or something like that from a ransomware attack or something, you're going to say, well, how did that happen? And so you have to look at that strategically. And when you build out a strategic plan, and even if you're in the middle of a cycle, have someone, have your lead IT person, invest in the opportunity to have someone come in and look at your work from a strategic perspective, but from a specific technology perspective.
I could not have said that better. So one of the things that we have been fighting for, and we've noticed over the years, is having technologists involved in strategic planning
Yep.
of the business process. For some reason, we are looked at in the IT field as more of the janitors,
Yep.
right? Or you keep them in the basement, you keep them down there, and they'll fix it when a problem arises.
Yep.
When the executive can't get to their email, that's when you call IT.
Yep.
Any other reason, it is a cost, and people look at it as just a raw cost, and they want to control that dollar value. And I understand that, and everybody has a budget, and everybody has to abide by that budget. But if you are basing your budget off of all business reviews and no technologist review, then you're, one, only getting half of the
Yep.
equation, but two, you could be dooming yourself. I've seen a lot of people make these strategic moves, and maybe it's a move in the wrong direction, or we've been talking about this a lot, it's a move to stay put. And we've been doing a lot of initiatives with rural healthcare. It's been a really big push here at FSI, and if you guys have seen anything, that's what we've been talking about and doing. And one of those things is, the question is, yes, the total cost of ownership of the cloud goes down over time, and all of these are things, and there's a million reports to show it. What is the total cost if you don't go?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And what happens if that attack happens? What happens if that Exchange server fails? Yep. What happens if a hurricane hits, or an earthquake hits, or act of God,
Yep.
one of these things happens, and you're still on-prem, or you haven't backed up these systems,
Yep.
and it could be catastrophic.
Yep.
And this leads back to kind of where we began, but making strategic and smart investments, and having, even if you just bring in that tech person for a couple conversations,
Yep.
that's better than leaving them out completely.
Yep, exactly.
I mean, I would like them to be in the process all the way
Yep.
through.
Yep.
But I understand that's not always
Yep.
the case. But you have to involve them. You have to plan, and your plans need to be malleable.
Yep. Yep.
Technology changes very fast, and setting a 4-year plan in place, while that's wonderful, you need to have flexibility within that plan, because the technology is going to shift. 4 years ago, what we were talking about is very different than what we're talking
Yep.
about today.
Exactly.
And
speaking of strategic plans and budgets, I mean, one of the just sort of industry standard benchmarks for nonprofits, NGOs, and so forth. I mean, if you're not spending 4% of your budget on technology, you need to understand, why and what that is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of, as you wisely mentioned, a lot of nonprofits will try to get by with it cheap. That's a cost of control. It's sort of a keep the lights on type
Mm-hmm.
of thing, and
I understand that the mission is very important.
Yep. And
right?
So, they'll be at 1%.
Yeah.
So, and they'll say, well, that's enough, isn't it? No, it's not enough. And it's really about having someone that is in the technology space, helping. Obviously, if you have your own IT person or something like that, I mean, that's great. Go to them. But there's a huge need to be able to understand the benefit or the impact that technology can have on furthering, the strategic plan, the mission and vision of your organization.
And then one thing, that bringing it back to the cost aspect on the 4%, if you're not spending that, let's say you're only spending 1%, and IT creates an issue, and I don't mean IT as in there's a failure. There's
Mm-hmm.
just things that go wrong in IT. CrowdStrike happens, right? Yep. And you lose more than you're putting in.
Exactly.
The only person you have to really blame is kind of look at yourself and be like, well, I saved 3% every year for 5 years. Well, what did it just cost you to be down for a week?
Yep, exactly.
What did, if a person loses 7% of their time, and you're like, yes, we saved 1% of their time, come on, the numbers have to even out.
Yep.
And in a lot of cases, what I see is it's a lot of celebration on cost cut, but not a lot of celebration on, hey, this is how many things we prevented.
Exactly.
Our employees are extremely happy with the product that we provide. That brings that's an intangible.
Mhm.
And then not only that intangible, the ability to quickly communicate and those things, those are really hard to actually pin down. But like you said, that's not going to show up in your 4%
Exactly.
number,
Exactly.
right? Like that's not going to show up on a report. It might show up on some employee happiness index survey or something like that, but it's not going to show up on your day-to-day
Yep.
hard KPIs.
Yep.
And you should just realize that, hey, maybe you are spending way less than you should be.
And then, one of the ways too that I found a lot is just, a lot of people think that if I have a, a director of IT and I have a technical support person, let's say, two-person IT, and they're managing our laptops, they're, managing our licensing for email and, keeping our website up and running and stuff like that. I say, well, that's all we need. If you go back to what we talked to briefly about the shadow IT, if you actually inventory all the things that would be considered technology. So let's get into your finance software. Let's get into your HR software. Let's get into your, your CRM, your project management, or lack of project management software. You're doing on paper or something like that. If you look at any organization and take that inventory, which is something that I always advise people to do, if you go into an organization the first time, or if you're wanting to look at this, from a strategic perspective, take an inventory. And a lot of times it's just walking door to door, doing what I call a day in the life of, and sitting down with another team member in another, department and saying, show me what you're doing. And you'll find that they're using a lot of technology. And they're charging that to the organization.
Yep.
And so what's on your GL for IT, is maybe, say it's 1%. But if you start adding up all of those other things, or the, especially the cost of the time it takes them to not have a centralized solution, then you are probably at a much higher percent than like even 4%. You may be even higher, but you can manage it from that perspective.
There was something that came out a couple of years ago about application switching, and that the average person switches over 170 applications in a day or something like that. And it was just like a ridiculous, mind-blowing number. And then we started looking at it and we started doing things, and we were like, actually, that might be low. And it's all of the things that you just mentioned that pop up, and they're like, oh, well, this isn't technology.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, you're using your phone. That's a computer.
Yep.
And you're using Outlook on your phone. Well, that's connected to Microsoft 365. Yep. And like, what are all of these little costs going to add up to? And with the application switching, it was like an hour a day or something.
Yep, exactly.
And well, what could your people do with an hour? How much, in the nonprofit world, it's all about the mission. So like, what could you do if you call it an hour a day with an extra 5 hours a week? That's almost a full day.
Yeah.
And I'm not telling everybody to work 40 hours and work yourself to the bone.
Right.
But God, I would love an extra hour a day.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I'm sure, this scenario is never happened, but, you're all excited. You're submitting for an RFP, and, or maybe it's a grant application, and, everybody's, worked weekends and everything to have this done. And then you're ready to push the button. Your marketing teams looked at it, your finance teams looked at it, and you get to the point where, okay, who's going to submit that? Okay, well, the executive assistant, CEOs looked at it, the executive assistant's going to push the button. It's like, oh, who has the latest copy? Where'd it go? Oh, wait a second. No, this one's like 5 days old. It's like, well, wait a second. Didn't you have it last? And it's like, no. And so, and you get into these, just panic situations, and you end up submitting, and you have submitted the thing that has all the spelling errors on it. Yep. And so there's critical factors to having a strategic plan and having an assessment of all the technologies, and understanding really what are these technologies that can have all these really cool cruise control things on them that you can use, and just make sure that you present yourself to all the critical factors of running a nonprofit to the places you need to have them by having the best and latest and greatest.
Yeah. I'm loving our conversation, because it's kind of like a little roadmap, right? We're giving everybody a little roadmap.
Yep.
Look at what technology you currently have today. Look at what technology you have available. That's a big one. Go out there and look. Nonprofit pricing, or philanthropic pricing, or charity pricing, whatever the organization calls it, most have something out there. So check those things out. make sure that hopefully you have an IT person. We understand that not every organization is big enough. So in that case, you need to have either a contractor or a company like FSI, somebody out there to come in and give you that strategic guidance. That's a must, in my opinion. And then making sure that strategic guidance aligns with the business values and the business plan for the future.
Yep.
And then looping that back up. This is just a continuous process, right? You know, people want to say we're going to plan for 4 years. Well, you're going to plan for 4 years, but you also need to plan for 6 months and 12 months. And then at 12 months, I guarantee you what your plan was for 4 years is completely going to be, you know, altered. But with that, I just want to kind of wrap up and thank you for, you know, coming out and talking to us. And I really love your insights on, like, these are basic things, but I don't think a lot of people think of them.
Right.
You know, just involving IT in basic discussions, I think can really change things a lot.
Exactly. So completely agree.
But thanks for coming out, and look forward to talking to you again.